My name is Sarah. I grew up in a very poor household. This was because my father had agreed to act as a guarantor for a friend's debt. That friend ran away, leaving my father responsible for paying back the debt. As a result, I was raised in a household where we were always struggling with money. Then, when I was in the ninth grade, my father passed away due to illness. After that, my mother also passed away suddenly, maybe from overwork, or perhaps she had been hiding her poor health. Being an only child, I ended up moving in with my mother's family after she died. There, I lived with my grandmother Amanda, just the two of us. After I graduated high school, I immediately began working. I got a job as a secretary at a small transport company, a very homey place where everyone felt like family. 3 years into my job, the company president's wife, Sabrina, mentioned she wanted to introduce me to a man. "Sarah, why don't you at least meet him? He's from a wealthy family, and he's looking for a good match." She said this while handing me a photo of the man. I'd never dated anyone before, so I was hesitant, thinking that. I opened the photo. The man looked calm and reserved. Maybe he was about the same age as me. Just think about it. "There's no rush to give an answer," Sabrina said. That day, I went home and thought it over carefully. It's just me and my grandmother, who is almost 70, living in this house. I can't keep living with her forever. Grandma's also getting older, and if something were to happen to her, I'd truly be alone. I thought that showing Grandma a happy life might be my way of repaying her. And Sabrina did say it would only be a meeting, so I decided to give it a try. The next day, I told Sabrina, and she was delighted, and immediately reached out to the other side. On the day of the meeting, the man, Mike, appeared just as he did in the photo, calm and reserved. If anything, I'd say he seemed a bit on the quiet side. During our time together, his mother did most of the talking. Mike was working as an executive at his father's company. He seemed to come from a completely different world from mine, where money struggles were non-existent, and I found myself envious. If I married him, maybe I'd never have to worry about money again. That made me think that marriage might not be such a bad idea. I'd never had a significant romantic relationship or dated anyone seriously, and I didn't have anyone in mind. I figured being married might be better than being alone. However, when I seriously thought about marriage, I felt really anxious about leaving Grandma alone. When I told Grandma about it, she said gently, "Sarah, do what makes you happy, but if it becomes too hard, come back. I may not be able to do much for you, but you can always come home to this house." Her words gave me peace of mind, and I decided to marry him. But right after the wedding, I started to regret it. Mike, though he held the title of an executive, was essentially unemployed, rarely even going to the office. I had a vague sense of this, but he spent every day at home doing nothing. Since Mike lived with his parents, I naturally moved in with them too after the marriage. Upon my in-laws' request to support their son, I also quit my job. So, during the day, it was just me, Mike, and my mother-in-law, Megan, at home. To be honest, it felt stifling. My father-in-law, Kevin, was a quiet man, always busy with work, and rarely interacted with the family, preferring to stay in his room whenever he was home. Megan handled everything around the house. Even when I offered to help, she would say, "Sarah, you don't have to do anything. We're grateful enough that you married Mike." But I had grown up doing household chores with my mother and grandma, so doing nothing at home gradually became difficult for me. Compared to the days of poverty, I didn't worry about money or food, but I began to feel dependent on his parents, and this lack of freedom made me uncomfortable. I even felt hesitant to visit Grandma, so I rarely went. Finally, I decided to confide in Mike. What's on your mind? I can't just stay at home doing nothing. I'd like to work, even if it's part-time. Why would you want to work? We're not lacking money, and my parents are fine with you staying home. Mike looked at me with a puzzled expression. Since we'd married, we hadn't really opened up to each other, so this felt like the first real conversation we'd had as a couple. I'm not sure if you'll understand, but I grew up in a poor household, and doing nothing makes me uneasy. We have financial security and all, but I still want to work a bit. I feel constrained. I see. Then do as you like. I'll speak to my parents about it. Where do you want to work? I haven't decided yet, but I'll look around. Thank you. He surprisingly agreed to let me work without much fuss. Soon after, I managed to find a part-time job, working 3 days a week as a secretary. Though Megan didn't directly say anything about my working, she seemed less than pleased. We haven't left her lacking for anything. So why does she want to work? It makes it seem like we're making her. Once, I overheard her telling Kevin, and I wish she'd just have a grandchild for as soon. She vented her frustrations, but I wasn't ready for that yet. How could I, when I still didn't feel any love for him? Maybe marrying for financial stability doesn't lead to happiness after all. Despite my regrets, going to my part-time job 3 times a week became my escape. On my way home from work, I'd stop by Grandma's for a little while, and she'd be so happy to see me, which made me genuinely glad. On the first payday after starting my part-time job, I bought a cake on my way home. I hoped Megan would be pleased. After all, since we were living together, I genuinely wanted to get along with her, but my hopes were dashed. She wasn't pleased at all. I don't have much of an appetite today, Megan said, leaving the cake untouched. Seeing my disappointment, Mike did something unusual. I'll make some coffee. Do you want tea, Sarah? He asked, then brought me some tea. I'll eat Mom's portion. Dad's going to be home late anyway, he said, starting to eat the cake. It's my payday today, so I bought the cake to celebrate, I told him. Mike looked at me in surprise. Really? Because it's your payday, you bought a cake? That's different, Sarah. You should just spend the money on yourself. He seemed genuinely puzzled. In the end, we ate the cake together, without talking much to Megan. A few days later, as I was getting ready for work, I was surprised to see Mike dressed in a suit. What's with the suit? I asked, taken aback. I thought I'd go to the office for a change. Though I honestly don't know what I'll be doing there, he replied. I had no idea why he suddenly decided to go to work, but I figured it was better than doing nothing. Would he keep it up? I wondered. But to my surprise, from that day on, Mike started going to the office every day. One evening, on my way home after stopping by Grandma's, I saw Mike waiting for me at the bus stop. Oh, were you waiting for me? I asked, surprised. He smiled and said, I figured you'd be coming back around now. Today was my first payday since I started going to the office, so I thought, why don't we eat out to celebrate? I already let my mom know. Yes, this is a first. Thank you. I was thrilled. It was our first meal out together since getting married. I felt a bit nervous, dining with Mike in his suit. And for the first time, I told Mike that I'd been stopping by Grandma's after work. Oh, you didn't have to feel hesitant about that, but I get why it might feel that way. Sorry about that, he said apologetically. I felt that the emotional distance between Mike and me, who had just been housemates up to this point, was growing closer day by day. I decided to ask Mike something that had been on my mind. Hey, Mike, why did you suddenly feel like going to the office? He thought for a moment before answering. I'm not sure. I can't really explain it myself, but when I saw how you wanted to work, or how you bought a cake because it was payday, I started wondering, what drives someone to feel that way? And before I knew it, I thought, maybe I should give it a try. To be honest, I don't really understand it either. He laughed as he said this. My family was very poor, but on payday, my dad would always bring home a cake, a single, tiny strawberry shortcake. Even though it was small, it made me happy ever since I was a kid, I shared with him. I never did anything on my own growing up, he replied. Or maybe it's more accurate to say I couldn't. I was too concerned about my parents' expectations. Even if I made friends, they'd tell me not to hang out with certain kids. They'd criticize me, and I ended up just following whatever they said. I've hardly made any decisions for myself, but seeing you, someone who knows what they want and makes choices for themselves, it made me feel a bit envious. So, for the first time, I made a decision. I decided to go to the office. That day, I learned for the first time how he really felt. He told me that even his job had been chosen for him, and that he had been afraid to confront his parents at work. From that day on, our relationship grew closer, but things remained awkward with Megan. In fact, the awkwardness escalated to the point where she started ignoring me completely. Seeing me like this, Mike spoke up. I'm sorry about my mom, Sarah. Maybe we should live on our own. I was taken aback. But wouldn't Megan and Kevin be angry? To be honest, I thought of our marriage as something for stability. It feels like I deserved this treatment because my reasons weren't entirely pure. As I said this, Mike chuckled. Hey, I only met you because my parents wanted me to. And I married you because they told me to. So, we're in the same boat. But since we're a married couple now, don't you think we should start thinking about our future together? And for that, maybe it's okay to start living on our own. The Mike who spoke now was different from the quiet, reserved person I had first met. By that moment, I was already feeling drawn to him, to the point that I wanted to try living together, just the two of us. But there was no way Megan and Kevin would ever allow us to do that. If we even suggested it, Mike might not be able to continue going to the company he had finally started attending. And what about his job? If we moved out, would Mike still be able to go to work? Would Kevin even permit him? Surprisingly, he seemed positive. Meeting you made me realize how fortunate I am. I've been relying on my parents too much. Now I want to make my own choices and do things for myself. And if the company tells me not to come anymore, I'll find another job and work hard. So don't worry. That night, Mike told Megan and Kevin that he wanted us to live on our own. Of course, they were vehemently against it. What are you talking about? Mike, you can't do anything on your own. How do you plan to live with just the two of you? We've always lived as a family, Megan insisted, desperately trying to talk him out of it. Even Kevin, who was usually quiet, didn't stay silent that night. You finally started going to the office, and now you want to leave the house. Stop being so selfish. Then Mike suddenly knelt in front of Megan and Kevin and pleaded, Dad, Mom, thank you for everything. I know I've relied on you too much, and you've always been there to protect me. I used to take that for granted, but now I want to try doing things on my own. He paused, his voice trembling slightly, and continued, fighting back tears. I feel like I can change if I'm with Sarah. I want to try just the two of us. Hearing his words, tears welled up in my eyes, and I stood by his side. Please, I ask this as well. I'll do everything I can to support Mike. Please let us try, I said. Kevin and Megan looked stunned, unable to say anything. They probably hadn't expected us to stand together like this, openly defying them to say we wanted to live on our own. He continued earnestly expressing his feelings. I'll keep going to the company. Even if they tell me not to come, I'll go. That's the one way I can show gratitude as a son right now." After a moment, Kevin finally said, "Fine, do as you please," and returned to his room. Megan just looked down and started to cry in silence. That day, Mike looked so strong and impressive that I completely fell in love with him. From then on, we began living together. He continued working at the company, but in a different department where he hardly had to interact with Kevin, so they rarely saw each other. Even so, just as he promised while pleading with his parents, Mike continued going to work. I took on part-time work while managing our household chores. Even though we'd moved out, I didn't want Mike to lose his connection with his parents. Having lost my own parents early on, I valued that bond too much to wish it severed. However, as days passed, Megan and Kevin continued to avoid us, and whenever I tried calling, they'd quickly end a conversation, saying they were busy. We didn't have any opportunities to meet. While those strained days continued, my bond with him grew deeper. 1 year after we started living together, my grandma passed away. Since Mike had begun visiting her with me after we moved out, she had been so happy to spend time with us. I felt she passed peacefully, having witnessed my happiness. On the day of her funeral, Megan and Kevin came. "Thank you for coming, Kevin, Megan," I said, bowing, and Mike thanked them as well. "It must have been so hard," Kevin said, then suddenly started to cry. Kevin, crying. He continued, "I held out and kept my distance, too stubborn to come see you until things came to this. I'm sorry." Then Megan added, "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I felt like I was losing my son, and it made me jealous. I should have been happy that he got married, but I was foolish. I'm truly sorry." She gently placed her hand on my stomach and said, "I'll be a good grandma, just like your grandma was," though my belly wasn't even showing yet. As I wondered about it, Megan continued, "Mike sent me a letter. Just a single line saying, 'We're expecting a baby.' It was so short and matter of fact, but it made me so happy." Surprised, I looked over at Mike beside me, and he gave a shy smile, with a warm, thinner expression I'd never seen before. Megan added, "Come visit us any time." Even though it was my grandma's funeral, and I should have felt lonely, I felt this unexpected happiness blossoming within me. Perhaps it was one last gift from Grandma. That's how it felt to me. Shortly after that, I gave birth to a healthy baby girl. We started visiting Mike's family home more often, and Kevin, once so quiet, became a different person, laughing and chatting openly. Mike and I often commented on how powerful an impact a grandchild has. Megan, too, had taken up a new hobby, enjoying taking photos of her granddaughter, and had even started learning about photography. It's been 5 years since we got married. I never imagined a time like this would come, and now I have another new happiness growing inside me. Do you really think you can secure the job with such a half-hearted estimate? My boss, Nicole's voice echoed across the office once again today. I stood there in front of her desk, listening to her lecture, with nothing to say. So many mistakes with the numbers. "How many years have you been doing this job?" Her anger was only growing, and I had no words to counter it. My colleagues pretended not to notice, brushing it off as another one of her rants. "And you always smell like damp laundry. Look at the stain on your shirt. You're in sales, so take care of your appearance." At that, a female office assistant stifled a laugh. It was clear that everyone in the office looked down on me as they watched the scene unfold. But I was used to being ridiculed. No matter how hard I tried, I never managed to meet Nicole's expectations, so I had stopped trying. I did make an effort with my appearance, but I had no excuse for the stain she pointed out. There was a smudge on the underside of my shirt sleeve that I hadn't noticed. Over the years, I'd made every effort I could think of, yet nothing seemed to stop her anger. So all I could do was stand there, silently enduring her lectures. Each day felt the same, a dreary cycle of going back and forth between my home and the office. My name is Stephen, and I work for a beauty products company. Growing up, I wasn't much of an athlete, and I tended to be a bit reserved. But one thing I excelled at was studying. I managed to get into a prestigious university and passed a recruitment test without issue, though I ended up at a company that was a poor fit for me. At a beauty products company, most of my colleagues were outgoing, with polished appearances to match, but being short, a bit overweight, and lacking the social ease that they all seemed to have, I stood out in the worst way. I also had a bit of a stutter, so people often had to ask me to repeat myself. The only reason I got hired was because I'd scored high on the entry test, and there were a lot of alumni from my university. But Nicole had already pegged me as someone who required special attention. One day, snow fell for the first time in 3 years. Initially, we were all moved by the sight of it, but as it continued piling up, a bit of panic broke out in the office. Due to a mistake by the General Affairs Department, our company cars hadn't been outfitted with snow tires and were now unusable. After the snow had started falling, there was no way to get the tires changed, and we couldn't even get our taxi. That day, our team had multiple meetings scheduled with clients, and all the other sales reps rushed out in a hurry. As for me, I had to deliver several units of a new facial device to a client, far more than I could manage on my own. Just as I was feeling completely stuck, "Stephen, I'll go with you. That way we'll be able to make the delivery without any issues." "Right, thank you. That's a huge help." Nicole quickly adapted to the situation and offered to accompany me. I felt immensely grateful, but also nervous, worrying about what might happen if I made another mistake in front of her. With both hands full of supplies, we transferred buses and finally managed to deliver the facial devices to the client, who thanked us warmly despite the snowy weather. On the way back, Nicole, who was confidently walking a few steps ahead of me, stepped onto a patch of wet snow in her heels and slipped, falling hard right in front of me. I hurried over to her, asking, "Are you okay?" as I helped her up from the slushy ground, now covered in mud. "Ouch. I'm so sorry I wasn't careful enough," she said, blushing, clearly embarrassed by her fall. Luckily, she only had a minor scrape, but her skirt was soaked, making it impossible to continue on to our next appointment. Returning to the office wasn't an option, as there were no spare clothes there. Buying something new was technically possible, but there were no department stores or shops selling suits nearby. I glanced at her, looking troubled, and came up with an idea. "Nicole, my apartment is just a little ways from here. If you'd like, you could come by and dry your skirt. Then we could still make it to the next client." I suggested this out of kindness, though unsure if she'd agree. She surprised me by responding, "I'm sorry for the trouble, Stephen. I should be the one handling this. But you're right, the next meeting is hard to reschedule. Would you mind if I accepted your offer?" For once, Nicole, usually so strict, agreed with one of my suggestions. Feeling that our rapport had improved slightly, I led her to my apartment with a quiet sense of happiness. Nervous about what to say, I pointed to the building when it came into view. "That old apartment building over there is where I live." It was a faded pink building, with patches of paint peeling off. The emerald green sign gave it a nostalgic look. I half expected Nicole to look displeased, but to my surprise, she called it a cute apartment. Once inside, I handed her some of my lounge clothes so she could take off her skirt. I planned to lightly hand wash the muddy spots and dry it in my machine. As I worked, "Wow, Stephen, you have a high-end washer-dryer. This must have cost a lot." She suddenly noticed the drum-style washer and dryer in my small apartment. "Well," I admitted, "I actually bought it on a loan after you mentioned my clothes smelled once. I wanted to avoid line drying them after work." While explaining this, I washed the stains from her skirt in the sink. Yes, the washer made things much easier, though my already tight budget got even tighter after taking on the 36-month interest-free loan. Thankfully, her suit was machine washable. I placed it in the dryer and hit the start button. Nicole, for her part, was silent for a moment, looking slightly uncomfortable. Finally, she looked up at me. I'm sorry, Stephen, for casually saying that you smelled. I didn't realize how much effort you've been putting in. I'm really sorry for taking out my frustrations on you." Nicole probably regretted hurting me, as she apologized several times with sincerity. Up until now, I had seen her as a strict perfectionist, but her genuine side turned out to be warm and understanding. While waiting for her skirt to dry, I brewed some coffee and offered her a local treat popular in my hometown. To our surprise, we discovered we were both from the same area, which led naturally to sharing personal stories. Feeling more open than usual, I confided something I had never shared with anyone. Actually, I lost my parents in an accident when I was in elementary school. After that, I was shuffled around relatives' homes, which was a real struggle. Fortunately, my parents left me enough to attend university. But then I got into debt with a job a friend recommended, and ever since, nothing seems to go my way. It feels like my life has been one misfortune after another. I had never shared something so personal with anyone before, but in that moment, I couldn't help but tell Nicole. She listened intently, nodding as I shared. Once I thanked her, she put her dried skirt back on, and we returned to our usual boss and employee roles as we headed out to our next client appointment. 1 week later, after a string of late nights at work, I finally had a day off. As I drifted back to sleep, a sudden knock on my apartment door jolted me awake. It was only 7 a.m. Who could it be at this hour? Reluctantly, I opened the door, and there stood Nicole in workout gear. "Good morning. I'm heading out for a jog, and I thought you might want to join me. It's time to toughen up and get in shape, especially if you plan to stick around in the beauty industry. You'll need some credibility with clients." Nicole said this to me unilaterally, then continued, "Come on, put on your workout clothes. Within 5 minutes, we're heading to the park with the marathon course." She began urging me in a tone that left no room for argument. Despite the distance between our homes, somehow she'd made her way here. "All right, please wait a moment. I'll get ready right away." I grabbed the tracksuit nearby and hurried after her. Not used to exercise, I panted heavily as I trailed behind Nicole, who ran gracefully. In contrast, I lumbered along, my lack of fitness painfully obvious. By the time I collapsed after completing the 3.1-mile loop, Nicole looked down at me with an unexpected comment. "You said you don't like yourself, Stephen, but are you even trying to? From what I see, it's almost as if you're closing off your own potential." She then opened up about her own life. Nicole shared that her family was relatively well off, but her mother suffered from schizophrenia and required constant care. Nicole had taken on the role of caregiver, managing her mother's repeated hospitalizations and frequent emotional episodes. "Yeah, I guess they call it young caregiving these days," she said, giving a faint smile. I was speechless at Nicole's confession. I had always assumed she had lived a life free from hardship. What I'm trying to say, she continued, is that we all have to accept both our happy and painful pasts. Then we have to think about what we can do to make a better tomorrow. If you lost some weight and started dressing up, people's perception of you would change. And even work might start to flow more smoothly. You have so many good qualities, Stephen. You should enjoy life more. As Nicole's warm encouragement washed over me, I couldn't stop the tears from welling up. I realized then that I'd spent so much of my life envying people who seemed happier than me. I'd blamed my upbringing, even resenting my parents, who passed away too soon. My bitterness must have seeped into how I presented myself, and even my actions. Nicole had seen right through that attitude. She smiled, saying, "You've been through enough, so why not become the person you want to be now?" I wiped my tears and nodded, feeling as though a weight had been lifted from me. Since then, every day, rain or shine, Nicole and I jogged together. She joined me without complaint, always with a smile. As my stamina increased, my mindset became more positive. I started incorporating a balanced diet and strength training, shedding weight, and transforming day by day. Soon enough, I noticed a change in how my female colleagues treated me. The same people who used to ignore me or treat me as invisible were now greeting me first. Overjoyed, I reported this to Nicole. "That's wonderful, Stephen. You look like a completely different person. It's not just the weight loss. You've changed your hairstyle and have a fresh, clean look to your clothes. Everyone's noticing your hard work." She beamed. Seeing her eyes slightly misted with pride made me realize something. The reason I'd been able to push myself so hard was because I wanted her to acknowledge me. Somewhere along the way, I'd fallen for her. I wrestled with my growing feelings, debating whether I should confess. But then I happened to witness Walter, one of our colleagues, inviting Nicole to a movie in the office cafe. Walter was my age, and the ace of our sales team. I hadn't expected him to have his eyes on Nicole too. I didn't stand a chance against him. The next day, after our jog, Nicole called me aside. "Stephen, Walter asked me to a movie yesterday. Do you think I should go?" "Why are you asking me? You and Walter make a great match," I replied, my words tinged with frustration and insecurity. Deep down, I didn't want her to go, but I'd reverted to my old, self-sabotaging self. Nicole's expression shifted to anger. "I guess it was silly of me to ask you, Stephen, right? We're just jogging buddies, after all." With that, she turned and walked off. Although we continued jogging every day, her attitude became distant after that incident. I tried multiple times to apologize at work, but she brushed me off each time, refusing to give me a chance to speak alone with her. Then things took a turn for the worse. The HR department announced personnel changes, and Nicole was to be transferred far away. She soon took time off to prepare for the move, so I couldn't even see her at the office. On her last day before the transfer, Nicole was surrounded by coworkers wishing her well. There was no way I could get close enough to speak with her, and we parted ways without reconciling. Half a year later, I found myself at the airport, checking in for my flight. I was finally going to see her. I'd called Nicole earlier to let her know I was coming, and though I was nervous, I asked if she'd be willing to meet, even if just briefly. She agreed. Before my departure, I'd written her a letter, and by now, she would have received it. "Dear Nicole, I hear you've had a lot of snow there. Hope you're keeping well. For the past 6 months, I've continued working on myself, staying dedicated to my diet and self-improvement. I wanted to become someone stronger and more positive, the kind of person you would be proud of. My transformation isn't just for me, it's for you. Nicole, I need you in my life. You've inspired me, encouraged me, and shared my happiness. Because of you, I've learned to push myself and to truly enjoy life. Just as you've always supported me, I promise now to be there for you. Let's support each other and share the journey ahead, hand in hand. Please give me your answer when we meet at 3 p.m., 3 days from now, at the airport. From Steven. Since I wasn't sure I'd have the courage to say all this to her face, I decided to send a letter ahead of time. But I'm determined to confess my feelings when we meet. I wonder how she will respond. With a mix of hope and nerves, I boarded the plane.